Welcome back to the final session of this 4 half-day conference. It's been a buffet of monetary policy at the Max Bell School for the last few days, and I hope you have been enjoying it. This is often my favorite part of a conference, where we get people together, get the wise people together to comment. I don't know if you noticed the way that we structured this conference. We sort of structured it like a court case, where the plaintiffs spoke first. So we had 5 options on the table, and the plaintiffs were making their case for a change from the status quo. And then today, you heard the defendant speak. Not the Bank of Canada as the defendant, but a spokesperson for the defendant, Michelle making her case for the status quo. And now it's time to move to the next stage of the court case, which is the jury. So I like to think of these 5 wise people as a jury of our peers. So let's hear what the jury has to say. And we've got 5 dynamite people to talk about this. David Andolfatto is the vice president in the research division at the St. Louis Fed. He's been there since 2009. Before that, he was at the University of Waterloo for several years, Simon Fraser for several years. He's been thinking about these issues and writing about these issues and teaching about these issues for a long time. So David, thank you very much for joining us. Diane Bellemare is a PhD economist, PhD from McGill, no less. And a professor at UQAM, University of Quebec at Montreal for many years. And since 2012, she has been a Quebec senator in the Red Chamber, Canada's Red Chamber. So thank you, Diane, very much for being here. Kevin Carmichael is currently a journalist with the Financial Post. He's also a senior fellow at CG, the Center for International Governance Innovation. He has been writing about monetary policy for 20-ish years with Bloomberg, with the Globe and Mail, Canada Business Magazine, Maclean's, etc. Always insightful observations on what's going on in Canadian monetary policy. So Kevin, thank you for joining us. David Dodge needs hardly any introduction in this country, or probably most others. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada from 2001 to 2008. I had the pleasure of serving as his special advisor in 2004 and 2005. So I always think about David as my governor. He was the Deputy Minister of Finance for several years before that. He's now a senior advisor at Bennett Jones, and there's a lot of other things that he has done, but David Dodge has been thinking about policy and monetary policy in this country for a long time. So David, thank you for joining us. And Angela Redish, professor of economics at the Vancouver School of Economics at UBC. She's been there for many years. She's been thinking about monetary policy and monetary history. In 2000, 2001, she was also a special advisor at the Bank of Canada. So she was probably a special advisor to Gordon Thiessen, or maybe a little bit of David Dodge too. I'm not sure the timing, but anyway, so she's been thinking about monetary policy and teaching about it, writing about it for quite some time. So Angie, thank you very much for joining us. So here are the rules of engagement, folks. I'm going to ask each of those in that order, starting with David Andolfatto, to give us 3 or 4 minutes of their thoughts on what they have heard. Maybe they have a thought on some options that are untenable. Maybe they have some thoughts on the options that are clearly should be at the top of the list. Maybe they have thoughts on options that should be on our list that we failed to consider. But anyway, let's hear their opening comments. Then I'm going to have a moderated discussion with the 5. And if there are disagreements, we're going to try to get to the bottom of them. And then we're going to open it up for questions from the floor. So without further ado, David Andolfatto, take it away. And David has come to this conference ready with slides.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. I've decided not to present my slide deck because I feel like nobody else has. But thank you so much, Chris, and to Stephen for organizing this conference and for letting me participate in it. This has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed myself. in part too because I've had the opportunity to see so many friends. So for my comments, I just wanted to just share with you kind of how I was thinking about the issue of what the proper target is, or more broadly, what the best framework, monetary policy framework is going forward. And I thought, I'd begin by reviewing what was the Bank of Canada's record on this. I think that it's fair to say that the consensus is that the Bank of Canada's flexible inflation targeting regime has performed good or well, but not perfect. And this is kind of to paraphrase from a recent speech of Deputy Governor Carolyn Wilkins. So the bank itself kind of recognizes that, that there may be places where things might have been done better. I naturally then am led to ask where were these perceived failures then? And I think that probably there's two episodes. I think we could potentially identify the early 1990s. We know Pierre Fortin has been a very vocal critic of the Bank of Canada policy in that era. I do think he has a case to make that the policy was perhaps a little tighter than it should have been in retrospect, especially. But of course, we know that many other things were going on at the time. The fiscal situation was rather difficult. And so, there was really a kind of a lack of coordination there a little bit. In terms of the recent financial crisis, by and large, I mean, the interventions were all in the right direction. But along the lines of Nick Rowe's kind of comment, I would say that perhaps the bank could have been a little more aggressive. Interest rates did come down. They could have come down further. The longer end, they could have come down. Just in general, the intervention could have been a bit more aggressive. So that's by way of criticism. So in this context, I do not see this as a critique of flexible inflation targeting per se, but it's more of a critique of how it was executed. And perhaps there were times that the bank could have been more aggressive, but by and large, the record has been good. And so in that context, I basically line up with Michelle's assessment. I think the status quo with kind of some tweaks, especially on the fiscal side, are needed. One thing I will mention, though, is that nobody talked about it, but there's the possibility of negative interest rates. Most people think about this in the context of negative deposit rates, but of course there's the possibility that the central bank actually sets negative lending rates for banks, then permits banks to use those to borrow at negative rates and in order to fund private sector capital projects or whatever. This is something that the ECB is doing right now, and it's targeted longer term refinance operations. And I think it's something that we all should monitor very closely, because this is potentially kind of a very, very powerful monetary policy tool. And it would be interesting to see how it works out in Europe. So that's something I think we should keep an eye on. Let me just conclude about to say things to worry about. I think one thing to worry about is whether if interest rate policy turns out to be inadequate as an instrument, and I don't mean just because of effective lower bound considerations. Narayana's keynote presented one such scenario. I recommend everybody, if you get the chance, to read a recent paper by Michael Woodford. He talks about Keynesian effective demand's failure, and you can refer to his Jean Monnet lecture in 2020. He just recently gave it. It basically tosses out kind of the standard new Keynesian model and the rationale of using just the interest rate as a stabilizer. It turns out for some types of shocks, in particular the one we're going through right now, interest rate policy is just not going to do the trick. He lays out a formalism to show what he means by that. But let me just conclude by saying, I think that what comes out of this is that the conclusion seems inescapable, that I think it would be desirable to give a central bank at least some fiscal powers. I don't think these things should be designed unilaterally, of course. I think that they should be done in conjunction with, in collaboration with the fiscal authority. I think that they don't have to be necessarily automatic stabilizers. Here I'll add a little bit of a twist. I do think that the policies, whether they're like targeted transfers through a central bank digital currency, to people's accounts, I think these policies should be designed, of course, well in advance. They should be designed in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance, and rather than an automatic stabilizer, just specify what the contingencies should be to get these policies triggered, but then ultimately, perhaps for political purpose, to give the trigger to hand it over to the Minister of Finance. Let the Ministry of Finance pull the trigger and let the Bank of Canada be prepared to implement this pre-designed automatic stabilizer option. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. Bang on time. Adding fiscal firepower to the bank in a careful way. Okay, Diane Bellemare. You are muted, Diane.
I want to thank you to have invited me to this conference. I attended most, I think, of the conferences, and the one I missed, I listened to it because it was recorded. Although I have 4 points to make, 4 minutes. So my 4 points, I want to talk about the context and facts. Secondly, I want to talk about the credibility test. Third, my preferred option. How did it change to have attended to this conference? It's the dual mandate. And I want to conclude as a parliamentarian, because this is what I am since 2012. So first of all, I think answering the question of this conference is what should be the new framework for the renewal of the agreement with the bank and the government. I think in renewing this agreement, the bank and the government should completely take into account the context and facts. And the context is, as everyone knows, everyone has shown statistics about it, inflation is no longer a problem as it was 25 years ago. Unemployment is a problem, actually. It was less of a problem before COVID, but it is a problem and it will be a problem for a long time. And and even when we were at full employment in Quebec lately, the youth and marginalized group had a lot of problems. Another element of the context is that risk and uncertainties are rising. There'll be more and more in the future with the climate change. And if you look at some papers that has been done around the Bank of Canada about those risks and uncertainties, you cannot take that away. You have to take it into account in the framework. Another fact also is that lately, with the good governance we had at the bank has been governed pragmatically, and it has taken into account unemployment. It was not only the framework was inflation targeting, but in fact, when the governor was coming to the banking committee, it was clearly that they were taking into account unemployment and other real factors. My second element I want to make is about the credibility test. I thought it was really interesting. There was a lot of things that was said about that. And it enables me to say, I don't think that increasing the target would be credible. You cannot sell to the population that we want higher inflation because the cost of having it lowering down was so high in the past. I know I'm old and others are young and they don't remember the 80s, but their parents can remember them when they help the kids with the mortgage. So credibility tests enable me to say no to higher inflation, no to lower inflation either. And other things like also the nominal GDP, which is quite interesting, but in fact, it's so complex that it's really difficult to sell. So when applying the credibility test, the only test that's credible actually is the dual mandate, because the dual mandate encompasses price stability and full employment. So let me turn to the dual mandate. What are the issues that it raises? First of all, the goal of the dual mandate. And listening to all of you, brought me to the idea that if we have to specify the goals, we have to talk about price stability, and we have to talk about full employment. These are the two goods that we can maximize in a welfare function. Otherwise, it's not concrete. So these are the goals. Now, another issue that is raised by the adoption of a dual mandate, what would be the target? So looking at the targets for price stability, I think the actual target is okay, is fine. People have been used to it, and I think we should have this 2% with a band of 1 to 3%. Maybe more flexibility, maybe an average of time a little bit longer, but I think that's credible for everyone. Changing it, people will want why. Now, with the unemployment, I think it's very difficult to have a specified unemployment rate. So that's why we talk about full employment. And a target would be, I believe, the definition that was proposed 70 years ago by Beveridge and Keynes, which is full employment is attained when vacancies is equal to the number of unemployed people. So when you manage monetary policy with that target in line, in focus, then you can compare vacancies and unemployed regionally by sectors, and you know where you have to be concerned. Another issue about the dual mandate, I think, is the necessity to have coordination. That's a lot of people talk about it, and I think a coordination with fiscal policy is necessary, and using EI to specify the link of the coordination between fiscal and monetary policy would be quite interesting. I don't see it as something of a rule, you know, that it would come at some point or not. I see it more that if we look at the EI program, which actually is financed by employers and employees, it doesn't make sense that those two groups finance EI for stabilization policy. So everything that's for stabilization policy should be taken into account with government. And also, I would suggest that also the active labor market policy, and nobody talked about it, but I think that's a forgotten thing that's very important, because active labor measure, which increase skills, enables also increases in productivity and in the long run in the real interest rates. So there's a link there with growth. And so focus on the labor market, active labor market policy to make the coordination possible with monetary and fiscal policy in EI. Focus on skills, investment on, of course, income when you promote skill, but focus on skills enables increase in productivity and real interest rate. Now, my conclusion as a parliamentarian, you know, credibility is very important, but credibility is also social acceptability. And with respect to social acceptability, I think there's a lot of things that has to be done around monetary policy, because monetary policy actually has been a mandate that the bank has given itself, because in the law, there's no specific mandate. There's a big preamble that's really vague, that has been written in 1935, that has not been amended, so forth. And compared to other legislation in the world, in Canada, we don't have a mandate. We don't have a committee to decide of the monetary policy. Douglas Laxton talked about it in his paper, and I think that should be added to the agreement. And added to the agreement, as I said, the target and the coordination aspect. Okay. That would also make sense about QE. So thank you. That's just what I have to say.
Thank you, Diane, very much. We will be coming back to some of those issues for sure. Let me turn to Kevin Carmichael then.
All right, thanks, Chris. I'm going to use my few minutes to focus on what I observed as either a sub-theme or a meta-theme. I'm not sure which, but that's what Senator Bellemare called the democratic deficit around monetary policy in Canada. And I agree with that. I remember about this time in 2016 when Stephen Gordon, myself, a few others wrote some columns roughly around the same time, sort of waking up to the fact that we were on the eve of a very important, a fundamental policy decision, and there'd been essentially no discussion for the years leading up to that event. Now, of course, we were too late to the game ourselves. That decision went through without any particular public debate, as Stephen alluded to earlier this week. But I do think that that we, I don't know, I don't want to put too much emphasis on cause and effect, but I do think that noise that we made at that time did get some people's attention. The situation has improved. The Bank of Canada has been extremely transparent throughout this review process, working very hard to pull in the public, to involve people like me, to involve people like I assume are out there in the audience right now watching this, to pull them into the discussion and to make it far more transparent than it's been in the past. So the Bank of Canada is doing its part. Bravo, Stephen and Chris, for putting this conference on. I know both of you and probably the majority of the people watching have always have your avenues into participating in reviews in the past. It's good of you to take the time and the effort to bring some of that discussion out in the open, so at least people like me can have easier access to the sort of discussions that happen behind the scenes. And the fact that you've done this has created a treasure trove for me and hopefully some of my counterparts in the business press to return to keep this discussion going as we go into 2021. So maybe my business will do, or my piece of this, and my counterparts will do a little better than we did this time 5 years ago, or through the last mandate review. Now, there's still one piece missing, of course, and that's Parliament. So with all due respect to Senator Bellemare, my 20 years of watching this has led me to the conclusion that Parliament has rarely risen above the level of poor when it comes to holding the Bank of Canada to account, and regularly hovers around terrible. I've not observed the House of Commons Finance Committee or the Senate Banking Committee taking that role particularly seriously. And I can say with certainty that I've watched both chambers take testimony from governors and senior deputy governors every year for the last 20 years. So there's a missing piece, and we need to find a way to bring them into the discussion and bring them into a discussion in a serious way. I agree with Senator Bellemare when she said that there is something off with the fact that in 2020, the Bank of Canada still does not have a transparent, sort of open, functioning monetary policy committee. Something I've written about. I agree with that 100%. I do think we need something a little more, something like minutes from the Bank of Canada. That's missing. They've come a long way there, but it's still not as transparent as they could be. But the thing we need to do, I think, to call this whole process a success and to say that we've actually, had a proper democratic discussion, is to bring the House of Commons Finance Committee and the Senate Banking Committee into this in a more proactive and serious way. I have a suggestion. Perhaps David will disagree, and others out there will disagree. But Carolyn Wilkins told me in an interview earlier this week that they're making lots of progress with their research. They figure they should be, have things mostly in hand by the end of the year, which means by early next year, they'll be in position to sit down, look through all the research, and make some recommendations. Now, I don't know why those recommendations couldn't go before the House Finance Committee or the Senate Banking Committee or a joint committee or both, however it works best in practice. But it seems to me an excellent opportunity to at least to really give the public one last chance to see the best options that are on the table. So that's my option, or that's my suggestion based on what I've heard. I've written a column about where I think we could go or where I think we might be headed. with the policy review. I encourage you to read it if you want. I'm not going to take any more time though from the two people who are coming behind me, because they have far more informed things to say about the actual policy than I could pretend to have.
Okay, we may have lost Chris. Stephen, do you want to jump in here?
Okay, sorry, and thank you. We're moving on to whoever is next in alphabetical order. Who is it? Please. I don't have this. I'm sorry?
I'm here.
Okay, great. Phew. David Dodge, please take the virtual podium.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to start by, and I'm just an old guy who's been looking at this for a long time. I was a student 60 years ago when studying money and banking during the time Governor Coyne was having his difficulties with the government, and there were lots of debates at that point in time about A, the policy, and B, the role of the bank. But I think yesterday Narayama raised a really critical point, and that is fundamentally the real power of the bank is to stop inflation going up. We have less power at the bank to move inflation up to the target, and we are seeing that at the moment. Indeed, the history of inflation targeting was not inflation targeting, it was inflation reduction targeting. That's how we got into it. And the Department of Finance was particularly concerned at the time, I remember very, very well, that we were concerned that John Crow and the bank were going to drive things down far too fast and make life very difficult. And indeed, the agreement that we then came to finally was kind of a balance to ensure not that the bank wasn't overly zealous, but at the same time an agreement that it was really important to stabilize prices. And I think that history of being in agreement between the government and the bank has been very important here in Canada. And in fact, the Bank of Canada Act enjoins the governor and the Minister of Finance to consult regularly, and that is a legacy, of course, of the Coyne affair back almost 60 years ago, or exactly 60 years ago now. So the bank's real lever is to stop inflation going too high, and there the bank has control in a sense that it can, by tightening enough, ensure that the target can be reached. And that lever, I'm sorry, Diane, really does mean that an explicit mandate of employment being a target, maximum employment being a target, actually may not work. It certainly would not have worked to contain the problems which we faced back in the late 70s and early 1980s. As I say, an explicit mandate. Of course, implicitly, because of the famous divine coincidence, that is exactly how, in most times, inflation targeting is supposed to work. And so here I pick up on our very last presentation today, that we had today, from Michelle, going through how it is supposed to work, and why, in fact, probably where we are at 2% is better from a credibility point of view and from many other points of view than trying to change the rate. But what I would like to emphasize here is that this is an agreed target, and it is indeed, by being an agreed target, actually becomes the real fiscal anchor the government has. Because the government cannot depart too wildly in either direction in its fiscal policy, if indeed collectively we are going to achieve the 2% target. Obviously, at the bottom end, when demand is very weak, we do expect strong fiscal intervention. And that is, I would say, not unconventional fiscal policy. That is normal fiscal policy, in part through automatic stabilizers and in part through discretionary policy. But at the same time, we may well get back to a point where we have excess demand again. And at that point in time, we really do expect that the government of Canada doesn't put all the weight on the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates to slow the economy down. We expect fiscal policy to play a role as well. And so we do have this agreement, and I think it's very important to focus on the word agreement between the fiscal authority and the monetary authority on how, in fact, we're going to run stabilization policy in this country in order to achieve our real goals, which is high growth, high output, and high levels of resource utilization. And we can get there. I think we can get there exactly by focusing on where we have been at this 2% number, which is a target in the middle of a 1 to 3% band. And I think the emphasis we had earlier today on the importance of that band should not be forgotten. So finally, just to conclude, the one other issue that we've dealt with in the conference is, should monetary policy have other goals like financial stabilization and so on? And I think the argument here is that the effort that we see in setting the target in the agreement between the bank and the government is really a stabilization goal, and that the other goals, there are other targets to achieve our macroprudential goals, which we both share, but are not necessarily part of a goal, direct goal of the Bank of Canada. So thank you very much. I look forward to further discussion.
Okay, has Chris made it back into the room, or is he still in exile? Okay, I guess the last one will be for Angela Redish then, if you could notice, please.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks to you and Chris for inviting me to the conference. I must say I've enjoyed it immensely, and there's been a new insight, or perhaps an old insight, that I'd long forgotten in every session, so I very much appreciate it. I'll say too that I'm kind of disappointed. As many people have said, we've had inflation targeting, kind of 2% inflation targeting, for 25 plus years. And over those 25 years, there has been dramatic changes in the economy and the world, and there's been changes in economics too. So most particularly, as many people pointed out, the real rate of interest has fallen, and potentially for a long time. I know Michelle might disagree there. Expectations have been anchored, maybe not at 2%, maybe at 3%, maybe at 2%, but they're not at 5 or 10. And the Phillips curve has flattened as well. So that's the context, the changing context for the economy. In economics, experimental methods have been used, as we saw with Luba, which is exciting. There's also macro technologies we have heterogeneous agent models. We have macro models with financial sectors that are maybe not super strong, but they're there. So with all of those changes, I kind of expected that maybe the goal of monetary policy would change. And yet, as I'll come to at the end, for me, the status quo still, as for many people, according to the polls, the status quo is still a very strong contender. So I won't go through, I agree with a lot of the content that Michelle gave us, reviewing the different cases. I think in terms of Chris's analogy of courtrooms and plaintiffs, I think 3 of the plaintiffs actually pled guilty, right? People talking about raising the inflation target, lowering the inflation target, and leaning against the wind, I think they all came out for the status quo. So with respect to nominal GDP targeting, I'm not going to say much about that. I think I heard that the target would have to change every couple of years as the real rate of growth was changing. And I just think that the communications challenges there were huge. So now we're coming to the dual mandate and status quo, pretty much. With respect to the dual mandate, I kind of went back and forth, actually. Francisco convinced me that there was little to gain from a dual mandate relative to flexible inflation targeting. So I thought, okay, flexible inflation targeting, the speed that we come back to the target can depend on unemployment, on the output gap. So maybe that's enough. But then Sylvain's question in the last session really nailed what nags at me there. If we are actually using a dual mandate, why aren't we being explicit about it? And maybe it doesn't matter, but I do worry that my thought that we should stay with the status quo isn't quite logically coherent, and perhaps somebody can unwrap that for me. So finally, I wanted to talk about a couple of things, as many have, of changes that could be made. And the first one has to do with fiscal policy. And I think most people, whether you're going down the Narayanas route, that you have to have fiscal policy, maybe it's greater automatics or even contingent automatic stabilizers. I'm not clear on, and I like the idea that the agreement is an acceptance of joint responsibility for achieving inflation targets. I'm not sure whether that's in fact the case. And I must say a little bit, maybe like Kevin, I'm disappointed this time. I was disappointed in 2016. I have always been disappointed about the extent to which the Department of Finance does not engage in these, in as much reflection on inflation targets as does the bank, which has a maybe more or less open, but very committed research agenda. And I just don't see that from the Department of Finance. I wondered about a joint committee on monetary and fiscal policy. David said that the governor and the minister have to meet regularly. That's very different. I'm thinking here about a parallel with financial stability, where there are committees of OSFI, the deposit insurance, the bank, the ministry. So there's a sort of set up structure. And on the one hand, I'm very sensitive to the central bank independence issues, but perhaps there is something that would require the ministry to have a little team that actually thinks about inflation and inflation targeting specifically. Finally, the other thing that I wanted to bring up is that any monetary policy and any implementation decision has distributional consequences. I think we've talked a little bit about those, but we really haven't talked very much about the impact of monetary policy on the income and wealth distribution. I would like to see, for instance, a semi-annual report that talks about how monetary policy has affected the, or has had consequences for the income distribution. I think it would be more like a semi-annual report could be part of the MPR, but some formal recognition by the bank that its decisions have consequences for income and wealth distribution. Again, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the conference.
Okay, and are we, oh, good. It's Chris in the chat here. There he is, I see him. Hallelujah. He has to unmute himself though. I don't hear him.
He is actually unmuted.
How about this? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so, all right, throw away the microphones. Thank you very much. I actually did hear everything except 10 seconds of Kevin Carmichael. And I want to warn you, Kevin, I'm going to come back to you and ask you about communication, because you write about this to ordinary people all the time. And so I do want to come back at some point and ask you about which of the options are easiest to communicate from your perspective. I want to start though with, thank you all very much. I want to start with trying to find, I guess, some common ground or identify not common ground between the idea of flexible inflation targeting and a dual mandate. So David Andolfatto said he's pretty happy with inflation targeting, but you know, the bank could have been a little more aggressive in trying to, you know, spur things along and cutting rates at a particular time. And he talked about Pierre Fortin. I'm going to ask Pierre Fortin for his view in a few minutes. But I want to know, though, I guess, David, what's the difference between being more aggressive in an inflation targeting world and being quasi dual mandate? And so, you know, Angie asked about, well, if we're going to sort of be, you know, looking at the output gap, maybe we should sort of do it explicitly. And Diane is talking about making this absolutely explicit. But David Dodd said, well, if we really have to reduce inflation in a serious way, which is where monetary policy really has its strength, then actually sticking to explicitly the dual mandate may run us into trouble. So I guess I'm going to just ask for a show of hands from somebody on the panel that wants to jump in, because I want to understand better the difference between just being a little more aggressive, like David Andolfatto said, and actually being a dual mandate. So anybody? Diane, I'll go to you, and I'm going to ask for, let's make this conversational as much as possible. Diane and anybody else who has their hand up on the panel. Okay, Diane, and then David.
I will answer that question, Chris, by remembering that the USA has a dual mandate. And and Pierre Fortin did study about that. And what we look is that with the dual mandate in Canada, we wouldn't have had probably so much high cost in terms of unemployment in the 90s. And as I said before, I did chair manpower policies in Quebec. And I was chairing this board, and we were managing the EI programs. I had 1,000 employees in all the provinces, and we were overflown by the number of unemployed people, and we had the mandate to reduce unemployment. But at that time, monetary policy was very aggressive. The real interest rate was among the highest in the world at that time, highest than in the US. So it was really difficult to make a difference with this active labor market policies. And what we did was to reduce the labor supply. So people were going into retirement, and we share jobs and things like that. But actually, it had an impact on potential output and productivity. The Swedish people, you know, who have those active labor measures, and even in US, because they had the dual mandate, they were obliged to take into account the cost of unemployment. So taking into account, you have to take into account the bad effect that the monetary policy has on investment and on productivity, because productivity can absorb inflationary shocks also. So having the dual mandate may be more difficult to manage, but with coordination of fiscal policies, I think it can be done to the benefit of everyone.
Okay, thank you, Diane. David Andolfatto, I think you want to jump in on that, and then maybe David Dodge, I'm not sure. David Andolfatto, you're up.
Yeah, sure. I'm really sympathetic to the points raised that Angela raised and Diane and Sylvain mentioned as well. To answer your question, Chris, I actually think that a sufficiently, you know, a super flexible inflation target, something that was a bit where the central bank's willing to pursue expansionary policy a bit more aggressively, is basically does deliver that. I mean, and indeed, it might even replicate nominal GDP targeting over short horizons and contribute to financial stability for that reason as well. You know, if you take a look at inflation during the early 90s in Canada, it really undershot There's really no reason why the central bank couldn't have aimed for the upper band of its target. And similarly, during the financial crisis, inflation came in very low. And I believe the problem here was not the defect with the flexible inflation targeting per se. The problem was that in execution, it wasn't executed aggressively enough. And there might be natural reasons for why that's the case. Would making the dual mandate explicit help? Not necessarily. And it might open a can of worms. I would really encourage the Bank of Canada officials to take a look at the experience of the United States, which in fact has a triple mandate, by the way. But the big question, of course, is how do you define full employment to begin with? And I've been at the Fed for 10 years now, and it's just talk about a problem of communicating something. And in fact, if you take a look at the new framework that the Fed has recently adopted, it's just a contortion. It's just designed to, it's basically a mess. It's a Frankenstein in my view. And it's because of this dual mandate is explicitly in there. I don't think it has to be in there. And I think, the more aggressive, flexible inflation targeting, better execution, along with kind of these additional fiscal stabilizers that Michelle talked about, I think is the way to go.
Thank you, David. Okay, then David raised the issue of communication, right? In the United States, David Andolfatto's assessment is pretty clearly that communicating the new policy from the Fed, maybe even the old policy from the Fed, was challenging. Kevin Carmichael, tell us about communicating inflation targets versus how you imagine communicating a dual mandate might look like.
Sure. I'll come at that two ways. The first is that, look, the inflation target is extremely easy to communicate. The reason I say that is because it was communicated to me extremely effectively. Chris, I didn't have an excellent economics professor like you in my first year of university, so I probably shouldn't say this too loud given what I now do for a living. But my economics course cost me my scholarship. So, I'm not a genius when it comes to this stuff. So I showed up at Bloomberg on day one. I think we had to go to a Bank of Canada announcement either that day or the next. And I'm like, okay, so what are we doing? And it's like, well, it's monetary policy, CPI up, rates up, CPI down, rates down. It's kind of works like that. Yeah, made sense. And that was a pretty easy template to apply to reporting on the Bank of Canada and the economy generally. Now, just because that's easy to communicate doesn't mean that's optimal policy. Obviously, there's lots of room there to maneuver, lots of reason to think that we can do better and push ourselves to explain that much better. And so this brings us to the dual mandate. I think ultimately from a reporter's perspective that we doubt that a central bank, certainly one in a democratic polity like Canada, is particularly focused on inflation first and foremost. I think the assumption is that at the end of the day, growth is what matters. So that's certainly the bulk of my career. My reporting would have been tilted more to what's going on with growth, what's going on with jobs. That's what I observe most of my competitors doing. Now we know in the back of our minds that of course inflation is what ultimately matters for the central banks, but it's the frame we tend to use is one about growth. So I don't think a shift to a dual mandate, if we wanted to go there, would be particularly hard to communicate. And I think, there's probably a big portion of the population that would assume that that's already what the central bank cares about. Now, of course, there's still that segment of the population, though, reflected by the guys from CD Howe who feel very strongly about value for money, and that's a serious concern. And that's come out of late. The Bank of Canada recognizing, I guess, through some of the work it's been doing throughout this process, that there are a lot of people out there that don't trust the CPI, that worry a lot about what's happening to the value of their money, the value of their savings. And so, I mean, it's something to keep in mind, I guess, as if the decision is to transition to something else. I think there is certainly a segment of the population that is going to look very skeptically on a move away from an inflation target. I'll just close by saying, though, that I share the same confusion, if that's the right word, that Professor Redish shares, in that if we have this flexible target that we feel we can use to heat things up whenever we feel like we should, then why not label that as an employment target? Or why not just call it for what it is, which is a dual mandate, which is the bank tries to do 2 or 3 things at the same time, and just be honest about it. So my thoughts on that.
So I'm going to go to Angie and David Dodge, and then I think we're going to open it up because there's lots of people, I think, who probably have questions. In fact, since I haven't said it, let me say it now. If you've got questions for these panelists, these wise panelists, please put them into the chat room, okay? And then I will manage it from there. Angie, you had your hands up, and then I want to come to David Dodge for a comment on this.
I think there's different ways of thinking about the dual mandate, right? So a dual mandate, as in like the Bank of Canada Act, which a few minutes I had up there, but the preamble, the Bank of Canada is supposed to care about these things. But the inflation target is a very specific number and band, right? So I guess one question is, so flexible inflation targeting, there's a very specific band on the inflation part, and the output part is kind of, well, we're going to keep an eye on it. And I think, to my mind, that actually we select governors of the Bank of Canada specifically because we trust them to have the judgment to do that part right. And I don't know that when the Fed had a dual mandate, it had actually much less before 2012 definition about its inflation target and less definition about it. So as a dual mandate, keep your eyes on these things. And in that sense, I think the Bank of Canada does keep its eye on both things, but it's much tighter on the inflation definition.
David Dodge. David, you are muted. David, you are muted.
Okay. Look, I think it's very important to understand that the employment mandate is somewhat different. The idea of hewing to an employment mandate is somewhat different from the issue of the capacity of for the economy. And when we get into a situation where we get a supply shock in either direction, it can open the thing quite dramatically. And that, I think, was our lesson back in the early 1970s that we went through. And we didn't have a good hard target that kept our mind focused on how to deal with it. And so we ended with both high inflation and high unemployment during that period of time. And I think where we are, having it implicit is quite correct, and that the only way we can actually get a hard number that we're working to on both sides on the fiscal side is actually to focus on the target that we have on the bank side. And so we will be very flexible on the fiscal side. We are being very flexible right at the moment on the fiscal side. The one anchor we've got that in some sense is holding the whole ball of wax together right now is indeed the inflation target, and it's working appropriately. It's just that that the tools that the bank has to get inflation up a little bit, they're using them to their full capacity, but they're not enough. And so we use fiscal tools, absolutely appropriate.
Okay, thank you, David. I hope somebody will ask a question to David Dodge about whether it's weird to be using monetary policy as a way to effectively constrain fiscal policy. I first thought, well, maybe that's the tail wagging the dog, but then you made the point very clearly that it was really important that it be an agreement between the government and the bank, and maybe that's what it makes it not the tail wagging the dog, but hopefully somebody will ask that question. I have a question for the panel, which is, and it'll be my last question before I turn it over to the room. So please bring in the questions into the chat room. But macroeconomists, and you heard this argument from Francisco and maybe from others, that the bank basically has one instrument, so it sort of makes sense to aim at one target. This is the Jan Tinbergen sort of 1969 Nobel Prize argument, which is a pretty good argument. Pretty good argument then. I think it's still a pretty good argument now. But there's also this belief that monetary policy has a hard time making a systematic and sustained impact on real things, right? The notion about long-run money neutrality, even if it's not perfect money neutrality, it might be approximate money neutrality. Whereas central banks do have a sustained and systematic effect on either the price level or its rate of growth. So how do you respond to this argument that says, look, if a central bank ultimately can only influence in a systematic and sustained way a nominal variable, then we should only be targeting a nominal variable? So quick responses from the five. Diane is first, then David Andolfatto.
Very quick one. I think monetary policy matters. Monetary policy affects real variable, and this is really important to realize. And when you're in the field, you realize how monetary policy with interest rates have an impact. On your second point about Tinbergen, actually we have, yes, the rate of interest, but we have also non-conventional tools. And by the way, Tinbergen also said and propose coordination, because you cannot go without it, because there's too many intertwined effects between monetary and fiscal policy.
Thank you. Okay, David Andolfatto, then Angie Redish.
Well, I think I'm going to sound a little heretical here, but I actually don't believe in that long-run neutrality claim. That's kind of conventional. I think that inflation is a long run is determined by the fiscal authority, and that monetary policy can affect the price level or inflation temporarily. Monetary policy can certainly affect the real rate of return on safe assets in the economy permanently. And the real rate of return, I see it clearly in the United States, and the real rate of return on treasuries does have long-lasting implications for real economic activity.
Okay, thank you. Angie Redish.
Not as worked out as David there, but I think money is clearly not short-term neutral. I don't think money is long-term neutral either, and I think that, I mean, at the extreme, which maybe not so relevant, hyperinflation clearly has long-run, effects.
Okay. Any final thoughts on that from David Dodge or Kevin Carmichael?
I guess, Chris, I could throw out that my reaction to that point over the years has been to take your word for it and other experts like yours' word for it. I'm in the storytelling business, and I get feedback from the people or from our audience, and we certainly don't frame the story in a way that the central banks are can only do one thing at once, and certainly our audience doesn't believe that central banks are concerned with only with one target or capable only of doing one thing at one time. I think certainly over the last decade for sure, central bankers have emerged as superheroes, rightly or wrongly. That's the narrative now.
I have to admit, and many instructors on the call may agree with this, that in terms of the structured storytelling that we are trained to do and that we do, explaining long-run neutrality is not exactly the easiest thing in the world. Yeah. So maybe there's a very good reason for that. Let me turn it over to questions from the audience. And I want to come to Pierre Fortin first. Pierre, you have seen in this conference that the two, according to our polls, the two dominant choices are the status quo and a dual mandate. Yet for 20 years, you have been arguing very, I think, very passionately and very convincingly, frankly, in some quarters, that what we need is to raise the inflation target. That if we went from 2 to 3, or maybe from 3 to 4, it could solve some problems, whether they were downward nominal wage rigidity or effective lower bound. So I apologize. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but I know you can handle it. Why did you not make the case for a dual mandate? Why, and how are you feeling currently about a dual mandate versus raising the inflation target?
The answer to this is that I've matured a bit, thanks to all of you. I see this exercise at Max Bell this week as an exercise in trying to find a non-void intersection between what is economically desirable and politically feasible. And I see the 3 or 4% inflation target as something that is very unlikely to be supported by any segment of public opinion. So instead of continuing to focus on this possibility, I prefer to look at alternatives. And my take also is that we ought, the solution, the political economic solution in this context in which we are living now, is to go for a convex combination of Michelle Alexopoulos and Doug Laxton. By that, I mean that we would keep the 2% inflation target. We would keep the operational independence of the bank, but there would be in the renewed agreement an indication that we would enlarge the flexibility aspect of inflation targeting to include more transparent, perhaps stronger concern with unemployment in monetary policy. In other words, it would not necessarily mean that we would have to, the agreement would have to say that inflation, minimum inflation and minimum unemployment should be the 2 targets, but the wording should give an indication that we're going to evolve toward putting more weight on unemployment. There is a very important basic reason, which Chris, you alluded to, for doing this. It's that if the long run Phillips curve is convex, or as you said, flatter at a lower inflation rate, it means that you cannot choose an inflation target without at the same time choosing an unemployment target. So the 2 variables, unemployment and inflation, which were thought to be independent in the 1970s, 1980s approach to inflation, evidence is building up that we don't have that verticality of the long run Phillips curve. And so there is a basic empirical reason for putting inflation and unemployment as joint preoccupations by the central bank and the government. In other words, we're going to say that we are we are playing a 2-by-2 game, monetary, fiscal, and inflation, unemployment. We are going to play a 2-by-2 game, and it is especially important in a context in which the effective lower bound on the policy interest rate is likely to be, we're likely to be stuck there for a very greater frequency than before. For example, at the Fed in Washington, John Roberts and Michael Kelly found that, you know, we could be 40% of the time there. So one, the Phillips curve is convex, and two, we're going to be very frequently at the effective lower bound, and that means that it is impossible for someone like me to dissociate those two variables. At the same time, there is a Carmichael type concern about communication and transparency, which is that in the next 5 years, we're very likely to be, the public opinion and the economic situation is very likely to be concerned first and foremost with unemployment and not inflation, and inflation will remain very low. So I think putting more unemployment concern in the renewed agreement would raise the reputation of the Bank of Canada as a reputable institution that is close to the concern of the average citizen.
Thank you, Pierre.
I'm done.
Thank you very much, Pierre Fortin. I quite like your description of all of this as searching for the non-empty set intersection between political and economic viability. I think that's lovely. I've got 3 questions so far from the chat box. I'm going to ask the questioners to pose their question to one person on the panel, and I'm going to ask that person on the panel to respond quickly, and then we will see if there's any disagreement on the panel. And my questioners are Mario Secareccia is number 1. Number 2 is Sophie Strassman. Number 3 is John Murray. And I will wait for 4 and 5 and 6 to present themselves in the chat box. So Mario, you are up, and Sophie, you are on deck.
Yes, Chris, thank you for allowing me to pose a question here. I first of all want to say that it's quite refreshing to listen to this roundtable, because truly there are, well, in addition to Diane Bellemare, who I've known for a long time, and we worked together literally in pushing for this dual mandate, there are at least 2 others on the panel there, Kevin and Angela, who have also, I think, alluded to the importance of that, and have basically raised the same questions that we have been raising over the last while, which is, if they're actually de facto engaged in a dual mandate, why not put it explicitly? And the only answers that we've got so far, in fact, Michelle alludes to it. She says, well, we've, it might, we're afraid to make people believe that somehow there's a change in policy. Well, it's either to, I mean, there's a question of transparency here, I think, which is more important than anything else. And I do believe that this is a problem. But I do want to raise another issue. And that's where I think the question is coming from here. And I would like to pose that question to precisely those who agree that we should stick with the course of inflation targeting. David on the panel there in particular, but anyone else there would like to comment, both David Andolfatto, by the way, and David Dodge, by the way. But I would like to pose the question, which has to do with income distribution. In fact, Angela is the first person who actually raised it during this whole conference, from what I understood, unless I missed something. And what has happened over the last while is that, yes, it's true, the Bank of Canada has in fact succeeded in anchoring expectations at 2%. And what has happened is that wages, money wages, are pretty much growing around 2%, which means that real wages have been relatively flat over that whole period, but which has meant, of course, that the share of labor has declined by in the double digits in percentage points, literally. It has gone down significantly throughout that whole era. And does that not pose a problem for you in sticking with inflation targeting?
Okay, that is directed to the two Davids, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mario. That question is directed to the two Davids.
That's right. Who are supporting the,
Let's go with David Dodge first.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
No, I think it poses not a problem with inflation targeting. It poses a huge problem to governments that have a responsibility for policies that affect the structure of the economy, because it's the changing structure of the economy that is driving much of what's going on. So that it's the structure that has been driving the change in the distribution of income between capital and labor income, and within labor income between certain workers. The Bank of Canada can do nothing about that structure. It has to live within that structure. And so you can't turn over to the Bank of Canada responsibility for all that raft of policies which really dramatically affects that structure and dramatically affects the ability to get to whatever we might consider full employment, including what Diane talked about, the role of labor market policy in ensuring that there's a reasonable supply of skills to meet the demand side.
Okay, David Andolfatto, on yours. Your response to Mario.
Yeah, Mario, I mean, I totally understand where you're coming from with this. But my answer to the question of why not the dual mandate, I mean, first of all, I'll say, suppose if you want to put it in, and I understand why one might want to, I say fine, but then expand the set of instruments available to the central bank and make sure it has the tools to actually achieve the mandate that you're giving it. But as things stand right now, with the interest rate being the primary tool, and I alluded to the papers by Narayana and also Woodford, show that these instruments may not be enough to combat effective demand filters as they are. The other thing I might note is, Diane mentioned that correctly that the United States has a dual mandate and that it has kind of disciplined Fed policy as a result. And I mentioned, well, not necessarily, Diane. I mean, in fact, during the liftoff period, as I alluded to, I think a couple of days ago, when the Fed was threatening to raise interest rates, it was doing so when unemployment rate was still high, inflation was undershooting. The Fed has an explicit dual mandate, and nevertheless, the Fed embarked on what many considered, myself included, to be excessive tightening policy, despite the dual mandate. Central bankers can always come up with excuses for trying to be concerned about an imminent inflation. I mean, and a dual mandate is not in of itself going to stop that.
Thank you, David. Angie, I want to turn to you because Angie, in your comments, you raised the issue of income inequality, or maybe it was in one of your answers to a question. So what do you think? Do you buy kind of David Dodge's kind of hardcore response, or some people would argue that central bank policy has influenced the structure of the economy that David refers to?
Okay, I'll come back to that. Let me just say that the mandate of the Bank of Canada is to control and protect the external value of the national monetary unit and mitigate by its influence fluctuations in the general level of production, trade, prices, and employment. So to my view, that gives the bank an overarching mandate, a dual mandate, if not triple mandate, I don't know, but which it implements through inflation targeting. So through flexible inflation targeting. And I am actually landed in the flexible status quo as opposed to an explicit dual mandate more than is in the act of the bank. With respect to income distribution, mostly I'm with David that the structure of the economy is what's determining, the changing labor share and so on. I didn't process Narayana's paper, which maybe would have some influence there. But that's not to say that the bank's actions don't influence the distribution of income, whether it's through asset prices or the speed of adjustment. And I think that, again, I appreciate the comment maybe from Diane about if you, I think Pierre actually, that the political acceptability, social legitimacy of the bank may be influenced by the extent to which it's open about its flexibility and its mandate.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to Sophie Strassman, but before I do, because she's going to change the channels a little bit here, but before I do, I just want to read to you all from the chat box 2 comments. One from Chris Roberts, who said, I disagree with David Dodge. Starting with the Volcker shock, central banks have been critical to driving the structural economic changes he alluded to. But then Nick Rowe jumped in and said, I think the best thing central banks can do to improve the income wealth distribution is to prevent recessions and the unemployment they cause. So I don't know where that leads you. So I'm going to turn to Sophie Strassman because she's going to ask an even harder question. Listen to this.
So my question is really about how do we make better economists? I am so privileged to be in this space. I'm a student of economics at the undergrad level, and I've done research and kind of tried to get into the higher level stuff. But I have less to say about macro. I haven't delved into it so much. It's been exciting and everything. But something that I've noticed is that my excitement for my own major is completely different from most of the people that I spend my time with, and I end up mostly going to the math and physics people who seem to be very technically obsessed with their majors, and they're like all excited for coming to class. And you know, how can we make economics more engaging? What do you feel drew you into this, and how can we bring this to more people? Because this conference was just so exciting. I mean, it's so inspiring, the energy. How do we bring this to make better economists so that we don't lose them to, you know, math or, you know, these other
Sophie, you can use a dartboard or you can flip a coin. Who do you want to pose that question to?
I feel like Professor Andolfatto, just because you've worked with students, but
There you go,
Professor
David.
Carmichael, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I know what generated my excitement about economics. It was I was working in the construction sector in Vancouver in 1981 when they jacked interest rates up to 21% or something. And I always am thankful I had the opportunity to meet Paul Volcker once and tell him he was responsible for me ending up at the Fed because I lost my job and went back to school. But one thing I've noticed is a lot of the excitement about economics I've noticed comes from foreign students, people from South America, for example, people from economies that are often very distressed. And in some ways, I kind of sometimes wonder if it's a good thing that Canadians are not so interested in economics because it's a relatively calm and boring kind of country. But,
thank you, David. Can I ask Diane Bellemare, you were a professor of economics at UQAM for many years, and then I'm going to come to Kevin Carmichael because apparently his economics course cost him his scholarship. So Diane, what do you think? How can we make better economists, and how can we make economics more exciting? I always thought it was, but okay.
For me, it happened when I was learning economics at McGill and when I was starting my PhD thesis. And my professor, Jack Weldon, at that time, asked me, you know, he knew that I was wondering what to do. And he said to me, go and have a walk in Montreal in some of the area of the subject you're thinking about, because I was alarmed by economic insecurity. He said, go and have a walk and you'll come back with a subject. So this is what I did. And I chose a subject about economic insecurity. And I did it not through modeling, but through historical facts. So, but this is how I started to love economics, by liking the subject I was addressing to. So that's why I worked on unemployment policy for a long time.
Thank you.
No.
Kevin Carmichael, any thoughts on how to make economics less, tooth-pulling, painful? Oh, you are muted. Kevin, you're muted. Kevin, you're muted. We cannot, there you go.
Sorry, I was thinking, what dare I say, given the audience? I mean, run away from math is a way to make it more exciting, but now the bulk of the audience hates me more than they already did before, probably. But read Robert Shiller's book on narrative economics. Would be one recommendation. And then track down Angela Redish's speech to the Canadian Economics Association annual meeting, was it 2 years ago? Where she laid out and used economics and economic thought to show how we really have unjustly and unfairly crushed the indigenous populations of North America. Just accept that there's so much more to economics than math. And I don't say that to denigrate the math. The math is obviously very important, and just because I don't get it and lost money because of it doesn't mean that it's not important. But just remember there's stories behind economics, and economics is really a way to tell stories, and the stories matter.
So I don't think anybody hates you as a result of what you've just said, Kevin, but Angie Redish loves you.
It's so true.
Angie, what do you want to say on this?
I wanted to say that here at UBC, the students' organizations are pushing us hard. And they've organized, for instance, monthly seminars where they ask profs to come and talk about their research to undergraduates, so that they, rather than just sit in a classroom learning models, they meet the professors and they hear what gets the professors excited. So I think it's the students that have been pushing us. We also have unpaid undergrad interns, but I think it's the students, by organizing, can really get something going.
I've still got 2 questions from the audience. So with your permission, I'm going to keep going for a few minutes. But a quick response on the economics, the math, how to make it interesting. I taught for the first 30 years in my career in the economics department at McGill. And now I teach economics in a school of public policy. And that either allows me or it forces me, or both, to teach a different kind of class. And it's not that there's zero math, but there is less math, but there's a lot more policy discussion. And that means there's a lot more stories about cool stuff. Sophie, my answer to you is, I always thought economics was the coolest thing around. And if your professors don't think that economics is the coolest thing around, then I don't know what they're doing there. It's just never made any sense to me. Okay, we've got 2 questions coming. John Murray is going to ask about the mandate creep, not the creep running the mandate, but the creep of the mandate for the central bank. And then Sylvain Leduc is going to ask some question that he didn't tell me about. John Murray, if you're still there.
I'm still there. The discussion we've just had sort of anticipated my question, but it does involve this mandate creep. And I'm not just referring to whether or not unemployment should be featured, but we talked earlier about financial stability, whether that should be put on the central bank. Angela, not to pick on her, raised the income inequality, but it goes further. Green bonds and the climate. We know the ECB and Christine Lagarde are putting that front and center. How far should we push the central bank? I know I'm sort of reverting to the Tinbergen tools and targets, but we can bring it closer to home with Mundell and the assignment problem, as he called it. The issue is not long-run neutrality. The issue is not even if monetary policy has an impact on something, anything, over a certain time horizon, however short, but really where its primary influence is. What's its comparative advantage and its absolute advantage? And I do worry about overburdening monetary policy, and looking at where it's going and the comments made by many central banks now, I do worry that this is getting to be an ever expanding list instead of minding your knitting, as my grandmother used to say. The other observation, I think you asked, Chris, what might have been missing that one might have anticipated a discussion on. And this is a little close to home for me, but it came in the form of digital currencies, central bank digital currencies in particular, and the lack of discussion on technology and how it might shape the financial system in the future and the way monetary policy might be conducted. For example, if there were a central bank digital currency, would this create the means by which cash could disappear more rapidly and central banks could conduct monetary policy in a more effective and symmetric manner on both sides, not just to tighten, eliminating or at least reducing the need for unconventional monetary policy and minimizing, if not eliminating, the need for unconventional fiscal policy. I guess I was a little surprised that there wasn't more discussion of future possibilities.
Okay, John Murray, you raised the issue, so I'm gonna impose it on you, which is the assignment problem. You've got two questions that you just laid out there. In fact, they weren't questions, they were comments, but you have to assign them to somebody on the panel.
Well, I'm going to assign the first one to Angela, and I don't know if I need to assign the other one, but if I had to, I'd give it to David Andolfatto, who's also a digital currency expert.
Okay.
I thought he might have said more about that as he spoke to the frameworks.
All right, so Angie Redish, comparative advantage of monetary policy and the limitations of the mandate. David Andolfatto, digital currency and ... And you have 1 minute each, and then we're going to go to our next question, and then we're going to wrap up because there's got to be an end to today. Too bad.
As John said, monetary policy has an impact on a lot of things. I think that taking note of what that impact is important. That's where I am with the, for instance, income distribution. I think keeping an eye on it in a very explicit way is a good idea. That said, I hear him with respect to mandate creep, and as I originally said, I have landed on the status quo, flexible inflation targeting.
David Andolfatto on digital currencies.
Hey, John. Actually, I think Tor Koppel did discuss CBDC in the context of Friedman rule and possibly the desirability of lowering the inflation target. My own view, I did mention it very briefly too, as possibly a way to streamline kind of a unconventional fiscal policy like direct monetary transfers to individual accounts through CBDC. My own view though is in terms of transmission of monetary policy, one thing we do note is that I mean, most currency is already digital, obviously. I mean, the bank deposits are digital currency, and but one thing we do see is that the interest rate on bank deposits aren't usually very responsive to the policy rate. And so one thing that a CBDC could potentially do is make the deposit rate more sensitive to the central bank policy rate and potentially influence the monetary transmission mechanism in that manner.
Okay, one final question from another fine McGill product, Sylvain Leduc. Sylvain, are you, yes, coming at us from San Francisco.
I'm trying to.
Sylvain, yes, are you good to go?
Hi, I got a question for David. You know, you mentioned the long run framework writing, and I would agree with you that that's not the type of writing that you would necessarily assign to your creative writing class. But it does have the, I think, some advantage in putting out there numbers that are quite important, and basically saying, you know, we don't see them exactly. We need to estimate these numbers; they're important, and there's sort of an accountability to me in putting it out there. And it's not that they're not important for the Bank of Canada. I mean, the model exactly has a Phillips curve with an output gap, and when you're at the 2% target, you know, the output gap is closed, and we have flexibility to bring in inflation back to target. So, to me, there's just, there might be at the very least an accountability, and you cannot sweep it under the rug. The number is important. We should discuss it. It's discussing NPR, mind you, so maybe that's enough. But you could view, having people discuss it and maybe challenge the central bank about that numbers. I don't think that would be a bad issue, a bad thing to have, as a matter of fact. So if you have any comment, it'd be great.
Just very quickly, Sylvain. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for that, for accountability. I guess in the one thing is, I think if we do go down that path, the Bank of Canada, they should look at the experience of the United States. It's just not a matter of specifying an employment mandate. You have to be very careful with the language, definitions, et cetera. But moreover, what's nice about the case in Canada is potentially, I mean, this is a joint, fiscal monetary policy kind of decision. And so if you're going to give the Bank, I don't think it's actually proper to say we're giving the Bank of Canada the mandate. This is a joint mandate. Okay, if it's understood to be joint with the fiscal authority, then I think, yeah, go ahead. But it's not just the Bank of Canada. You can't just say, oh, here, to John Murray's point, or here's a bunch of goals and mandates, but we're going to give you one little interest rate tool to achieve everything. And you got to be careful. I mean, I think I'm all for it, but then make it joint with the fiscal authority makes a lot of sense.
As the director of the School of Public Policy, I find myself wondering what the next conference should be about, what next year's conference should be about. And I must say, we have talked so much, we've touched so many times in the last few days on the need for coordination. Coordination between monetary and fiscal, as John Murray would say, the assignment of the tools. David Andolfatto talked about having more tools at the disposal of the central bank, or maybe you just want to build them into the formula, as Michelle was talking about, but have the fiscal authority do them. I think there is need for more discussion about coordinating macro policy and what better coordination looks like in the presence of, financial crises, pandemics, other shocks that we haven't yet imagined. I want to thank you 5 panelists. This has been terrific. And Steve Gordon is now back in the Hollywood Squares here.
I never left. I just forgot to turn on my video.
So this is what we're going to do. We are going to run the poll one final time. Stephen has developed a couple of figures in a spreadsheet. And as soon as we are finished the poll, he is going to incorporate those into his pictures, and it'll take a minute. And then he's going to show them, and then we'll have wrap-up comments. So please do the poll right now, and I think maybe I'm not allowed to vote again. Is that right? Really?
We have problem also being on the screen, I guess, to vote.
That's right.
Oh, is that right? Hold on, maybe Katrine can make
Okay, now we can. Okay, good.
Yeah, we can withdraw people, also withdrawing co-host permissions.
Okay, take away my co-host permissions, please, so I can vote. Come on. There we go. Man. Okay, so once, Stephen, are you watching it?
I am.
Okay, so we're going to determine when it closes?
Yeah, just make sure, no, just don't close the window when it's done, please.
Do you want me to close it, Chris?
Well, what are you at? What?
32.
Ooh, give it another 15 seconds. There's 43 of you out there, folks. So if you haven't voted, please vote. But give it 10 seconds, Nick, and then shut it down.
But leave it up so I can get down the numbers.
Okay. All right. So everybody gets to take a 1-minute break while Stephen Gordon in real time adjusts his spreadsheet figure. And then he is going to show his screen. And then I'm going to ask Stephen Gordon to give us his 2-minute take on the graph that he's about to put up. And I haven't seen it yet, so I'll give you my 2-minute take after that.
Okay, I'm closing it now.
And then we'll wrap it up. So that's poll number 8. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the last one.
Status quo 81, dual mandate 66. Third place is raise the inflation target. Okay, that's interesting.
Stephen, let me know when you're done and I can close it.
I'm done. You can close it.
Okay.
Okay, so
Let me just say, while Stephen is sharing his screen, you are all going to get sent some sort of survey that asks your opinion on this conference, including things about how it was delivered. And I hope you will take probably the 2 minutes necessary to fill out that survey. I have to say that from my own perspective, it has been kind of shockingly successful in its technical sense. It makes me actually think that we should have more conferences this way. And that way we don't have to travel and stay in hotels, etc. But anyway, Stephen, are you ready to show your screen?
yeah, I've showed it. I think yes, I think isn't it showing now?
Hold on. Yes, it is showing.
Okay.
Hey, everybody, can you see that? All right,
Okay.
talk us through it, Stephen.
Okay, so top one is the actual polls. These are in percent, and the blue. Okay, they're in the order of that they were presented. Blue is raising inflation target. Started high and then dropped pretty constant since. So the bottom is the change from the first poll. So these are the revisions, and it's like it is any kind of thing. The level and the changes are both important. So basically, the inflation target lost ground among the people who voted. Reducing the target, never really popular, but it had a small but stubbornly loyal following, and its support didn't really change during the conference. NGDP targeting started strong, didn't sustain that initial support. It also basically looks like the inflation target here. It lost about maybe 20, 25 percentage points, and never really, near the end, it really lost ground here.
I just want to say that I'm reading the chat box, and Kevin Milligan says, maintain the status quo is the most Canadian result ever. So, Stephen, do you want to give us your 2-minute take on whatever you take from those poll results?
Yeah, basically, the dual targeting is popular, but did not gain popularity. The only significant winner during the conference is the status quo. It basically gained almost 40 percentage points in support between Tuesday noon and now. So, yeah, it's in some sense this is kind of, well, you kind of expect that a lot of people think, oh, this is a good idea. You look at it more closely. Just like any new idea, they have problems, and maybe some people saw issues that they hadn't really appreciated before.
Yeah, there's a school of thought that says, don't throw out the status quo too quickly because the status quo is there for a reason. And to me, what I've learned is that it's pretty clear that the status quo, inflation targeting, even flexible inflation targeting, has some problems. But when you then think about replacing it with something else, you then are presented with various other problems. Some of them are practical, some of them are communications, some of them are definitional, technical problems. But anyway, to me, that's I don't want to reveal my bias any more than I probably have already. But to me, it is interesting that that over the course of the 3 days, the status quo gained so much. And that is, I think that is testament to the complexity of the issue, right? And monetary policy is complex. There's a bunch of things going on. It makes it complex. And designing the perfect system probably isn't in the cards, but you're looking for, as Pierre Fortin beautifully said, I thought, the intersection between what is economically viable and politically feasible. Anyway, I think it's time to end this. I want to end by thanking all of you for being here, all of the participants. We had 6 authors of papers, 6 discussants, 5 wise person panelists, I want to thank you all. By the way, we're going to be sending you a note soon to remind you when to send in your final written versions, but spoiler alert, it's October 15th. The goal here, folks, is that all of these papers and discussants and the panel discussion, your written words, we will put it all together in a lightly edited version. We're going to make all of these things available on the Max Bell website so that we can feed it into the policy debate that we hope will take off further. And we will do that by November 15th. So we need a month to take your papers, lightly edit them, etc. And then we will actually be coming out with a real book. Remember those things, a hardcover book, conference volume. We will be doing that, but we want to get the papers out into the public domain before that, because otherwise we will miss the policy window. So I will be letting all of you know, the discussants, the authors, and the panelists. Let me make some thank yous to some very important people. I'm going to start with Antonietta Ballerini. Antonietta, I don't know if she's on the line right now, but Antonietta was the one who was organizing all of the logistics for the conference that didn't happen. She was making the reservations for the venue. We had by the way, we were going to have a dynamite Portuguese dinner in this lovely restaurant on Peel Street. She made all of the arrangements. Sorry, we didn't get there. So she made a whole bunch of arrangements that we didn't get to use, but Antonietta, I want to thank you for doing all of that. Adriana Goretta and Clarissa Passos were also behind the scenes. You may have run into them at some point. You may have run into them virtually and been directed to a link or so. So thank you very much behind the scenes. Katrine and Nick, huge thank you to Katrine Klassen and Nick Salter. There are communications people at Max Bell. They've been doing all of this stuff and making sure that it ran well. And then when it failed only a little bit. So thank you very much for making all of this work. This has just been terrific. And my final thank you is to Stephen Gordon. Stephen, thank you for wanting to do a conference like this. Thank you for asking my view. Thank you for responding so positively when I said, hey, let's do this at Max Bell. I am delighted that we did it at Max Bell. I think it is a great conference to have, and I look forward to having our next one. So thank you, Stephen, for bringing that to everybody. And unless anybody has anything else to say, we are 18 minutes late, but I hope that's all right. And I hope you all get to the end of your day very quickly and have a glass of wine or a beer or whatever it is that defines the end of your day. Thank you all for being here. Monetary policy is important, you know it. Sophie, if you're still on the line, I learned that when you're tired of macro, you're tired of life. And I really believe that. So on that note, let me thank everybody and say goodbye to you all.